They say every story of corruption begins with a wager. But this was not a wager made in a tavern, nor whispered in the smoke-filled halls of some gentleman's club. No, this was a wager made in the dark intimacy of a Virginia bedroom in the year 1861. A woman, restless and hungry for power, bet her husband that she could seduce his best friend. And what followed was nothing short of annihilation. Within months, all three of them would be dead. And the truth, that black thread woven through their downfall, was not merely about lust, betrayal, or even murder. It was about something older, something buried in the soil of America itself. You weren't supposed to hear this story. That's why it doesn't appear in school books or polite dinner conversation. But the deeper you go, the more you'll realize this isn't just about one doomed wager. It is about control, about how men are tested, manipulated, and destroyed by forces they can barely see. A plantation in Virginia became the stage, a marriage became the weapon, and a bet, a foolish, intoxicating bet, became the spark that revealed a system of corruption hiding in plain sight. Picture it. The Confederacy just beginning to fracture, the nation on the edge of war, and beneath it all, a society rotting from the inside, tobacco fields stretching for miles, blood money in every brick of the mansions, enslaved men and women whose backs had built entire dynasties. On one of those estates, a wager between husband and wife pulled the mask off that polite southern aristocracy and revealed the hunger beneath. The hunger for domination, for possession, for destruction. But here's the part they don't tell you. None of these deaths were accidents. None of them were simply the consequence of jealousy or betrayal. They were orchestrated, calculated, as though the wager itself had been planted, like a poisoned seed, by powers that thrive on chaos, feeding off the ruin of men. When you see how this story unfolds, you'll understand that seduction was never the real crime. The real crime was the system that made such wagers inevitable and profitable. You've stepped into forbidden ground now. Listen carefully, because once I reveal what happened behind those plantation walls, you won't be able to unsee it, and you'll begin to question how much of your own life has been shaped by the same invisible hand. The plantation where this story unfolded was not unlike the others dotting Virginia's countryside. White columns, sprawling porches, tobacco leaves stretching to the horizon, their gold-green shimmer hiding the suffering that fertilized them. To outsiders it looked like prosperity. To those within it was a prison masquerading as paradise. And it was here that Caroline Ashford, the wife at the center of this wager, began her silent rebellion. Caroline had not been born into wealth. She was married into it, given as part of an arrangement meant to stabilize debts, to bind two families with dwindling fortunes. Her husband, Thomas Ashford, was a man of rigid pride, the kind who measured his worth not in affection but in acres, in bodies he controlled, in names he could claim in his social circles. He was a man respected, envied even, but inside his home, he was a tyrant cloaked in civility. The wager, then, was not simply the game of a bored wife. It was a strike against his pride, a test of power she knew he could not refuse. One humid evening in the summer of 1861, Caroline looked her husband in the eye and whispered the words that would unravel everything. "I could take your best friend from you, body and soul." The best friend in question was James Carter, a man Thomas trusted more than any other, his partner in tobacco trade, his confidant, the one man who knew both his secrets and his weaknesses. By wagering her seduction, Caroline wasn't simply toying with desire. She was daring her husband to confront the fragility of his dominance, daring him to gamble everything on loyalty and trust. Thomas agreed. Not because he believed her, but because pride made refusal impossible. A man in his position could not appear afraid. And in that agreement, sealed with silence, with a stare longer than any words, he unknowingly signed his own death warrant. The seduction was never the true danger. The true danger was what followed. For once Caroline set her plan in motion, she exposed not only her husband's fragility, but the corrupt machinery of the entire world they inhabited. What began as a private wager spilled into betrayal, obsession, and murder. And by the end, all three players in this deadly game would be consumed by the very forces they thought they controlled. And yet, ask yourself, why has this story been hidden? Why buried under a century of silence? Perhaps because if you look too closely, you'll see that wagers like this were never isolated. They were rituals, tests orchestrated in the shadows to measure how easily men can be broken. James Carter was not just a friend. He was a mirror. Where Thomas Ashford carried himself like a stone wall, unyielding, humorless, and severe, James was the opposite. He was charismatic, charming, and dangerous in a different way. He could walk into a room and have men leaning forward, women glancing twice, and servants whispering his name with a mix of respect and fear. He was the kind of man Carolyn had been watching from the shadows of her marriage, wondering what power might taste like in a different form. But here's the truth men rarely admit. Friendship between powerful men is rarely about trust. It's about leverage. James knew things about Thomas that could destroy him. Debts hidden behind land titles, violent outbursts covered up by bribes, even the whispers of a body buried near the riverbank years earlier. That's why Caroline's wager cut so deep. She wasn't just threatening her husband with betrayal, she was threatening him with exposure. When she first approached James, it wasn't with girlish flirtation. It was calculated. Every word, every glance, every accidental touch carried weight. She spoke to him not like a temptress but like a conspirator, suggesting that she saw him, truly saw him, in ways her husband never could. And James, for all his swagger, was vulnerable to that kind of recognition. The nights grew longer, the air thicker. Soon whispers of laughter slipped through closed doors. The servants noticed, then the neighbors. And finally, Thomas. He was not a fool. He could feel his pride bleeding away each time James lingered a little too long at the dinner table. Each time Caroline's eyes flickered toward the man across from her. But this is where most stories would end, with jealousy, confrontation, and maybe a duel. Not this one, because what was at stake was far larger than a wife's betrayal or a husband's pride. What was unfolding was a ritual of humiliation, a tearing apart of masculine identity until there was nothing left to stand on. And Thomas, though he believed he was the master of his world, was now nothing more than a pawn in a game designed to dismantle him. Caroline, James, Thomas, they were all trapped inside something older. A theater of control, a system that uses desire and shame to break men from the inside out. And soon the wager would spill into violence, violence so precise, so ritualistic, that it could not have been an accident. It had the markings of design. By autumn, the wager had consumed Riverside Manor like a slow-moving fire. What began as a private challenge between husband and wife now infected every corridor, every whispered conversation, every breath of the household. Caroline played her role with unnerving precision, letting the affair shimmer just beneath the surface. Never hidden, never confessed, but undeniable to anyone with eyes. And Thomas, bound by his pride, let it continue. But here's what most men never understand. When you refuse to act, when you allow humiliation to fester, you invite something darker into your soul. Thomas stopped being a husband. He stopped being a master. He became something else entirely. A man feeding a silent rage, a rage that needed an outlet. He began drinking heavily, walking the fields at night with a lantern, muttering prayers that sounded more like curses. The servants said they saw him kneeling in the dirt, clawing at the earth like a penitent sinner, as if trying to bury his shame where no one could see. Meanwhile, James grew bolder. His laughter echoed louder at dinners. His hand lingered too long when passing Caroline the wine. He began to behave not like a guest, but like the rightful master of the house. And Caroline? She encouraged it, not just because of desire, but because she understood the power it gave her. She was dismantling two men at once, one by seduction, the other by humiliation. But what no one expected was how far the game would go. On the night of October 17th, during one of the grand dinners Thomas insisted on hosting to prove he was still in control, Caroline arrived wearing a crimson dress so vivid it was practically a declaration of war. She sat James at her side, ignoring her husband entirely. To the outside world, it looked like boldness. To Thomas, it was treason. And in that moment, something inside him snapped. But here is the forbidden truth. The deaths that followed were not spontaneous. Not the result of drunken rage or a jealous quarrel. Court documents buried decades later reveal patterns, methods too deliberate to be explained away as passion. This wasn't merely a domestic tragedy. It was the execution of a ritual. And if you followed me this far, you're starting to feel it too. The sense that what you're hearing isn't just about 1861, it's about something still alive today. The same system that broke Thomas Ashford is still at work, breaking men in different ways. And most of them never realize they've stepped into the wager until it's already too late. The first body fell quietly, almost politely, as though death itself had been waiting for permission. It was James Carter, but do not be deceived. This was no crime of passion, no heat-of-the-moment brawl between friends. James's body was discovered 3 days later, half buried at the edge of the Ashford property, his throat slit with surgical precision. The coroner's report, filed hastily and sealed almost immediately, described the cut not as jagged or frantic, but methodical, as though executed by steady hands with intimate knowledge of anatomy. That detail alone should have raised alarms. Instead, it was buried, just like James. Thomas claimed ignorance. He told the sheriff James had left on horseback, heading south toward Petersburg, and must have run into bandits along the road. A convenient lie, but witnesses later testified they had seen Thomas and James together on the night of his disappearance, arguing in the library, the firelight throwing long shadows across their faces. Caroline was there too, her silence more damning than any scream. But let us not pretend this was only about jealousy. No, the precision of James's death reveals something more disturbing. Thomas had crossed into ritual territory. There were rumors that he had begun consulting an old manual of Roman law, mixed with fragments of scripture, as though he was searching for a way to justify the act. One servant, in a whispered testimony later suppressed, swore she saw strange symbols burned into the library hearth after that night, marks that did not belong to any Christian rite. Caroline, curiously, did not mourn. Her letters, intercepted and hidden in family records until decades later, show not grief, but calculation. She wrote to her sister of the cleansing fire and of the victory that comes from sacrifice. It was as if James's death was not a shock, but an expected stage in the wager's unfolding, and here lies the hidden truth. Wagers of this nature were never about seduction or betrayal alone. They were about transformation, breaking the old self through humiliation, through loss, through blood. In killing James, Thomas believed he had regained control, but in truth, he had only advanced to the next stage of the ritual. Now the net was closing tighter, pulling him and Caroline into a spiral that would end with both of them destroyed. This was never just a murder. It was an initiation. James Carter was gone, but his absence did not bring peace to Riverside Manor. It brought silence, the heavy, suffocating silence of secrets too large to contain. The household staff walked on edge, avoiding eye contact, carrying trays with trembling hands. They always knew. Servants see everything, though history rarely records their voices. But this time even their whispers carried weight, as if speaking too loudly might summon the same fate James had suffered. Caroline, however, moved differently. To Thomas's surprise, and perhaps his horror, she did not recoil from him in fear. She drew closer. She whispered to him late at night, her hand on his shoulder, her voice low and serpentine. "Now you know what power feels like." To anyone else, such words might sound like comfort. But to Thomas they were poison, because in her tone he heard not submission but mastery. And this is where the wager revealed its true teeth. Caroline was no longer testing boundaries. She was shaping Thomas into something else. She praised his brutality. She urged him to finish what had begun. And slowly, under her influence, Thomas began to lose the line between choice and compulsion. Was he killing to protect his honor? Or was he killing because Caroline demanded it? Because the ritual required it? Neighbors began asking questions. James Carter's sudden disappearance was too convenient, too poorly concealed. Men who once dined at the Ashford table now kept their distance. But Caroline knew how to distract suspicion. She threw elaborate gatherings, parties dripping with wine, laughter, and illusion. She played the perfect hostess, dazzling her guests while the shadows in her home grew darker. And every time Thomas watched her command a room, he realized something devastating. The wager was no longer his. It was hers. The next disappearance confirmed it. A traveling merchant, seen lodging at the manor, was never seen again. His wagon was found abandoned by the riverbank, his goods missing, his body never recovered. Rumors spread, but no proof was ever brought to court. Still, the pattern was emerging. Caroline's wager had evolved into a machine of blood and secrecy. And Thomas, too blinded by pride to see it, had become her instrument. She was testing him. How far could a man be pushed before he ceased to be a man at all? How many layers of identity could be stripped away before nothing remained but obedience to the one who whispered in the dark? The truth is this: the wager was never about seduction. It was about possession, and Caroline was winning. Thomas Ashford had always presented himself as a pillar, upright, unshakable, carved from the same stone as the plantation columns that fronted his estate. But stone can crack, and once the cracks appear, they spread faster than anyone expects. By the winter of 1861, the cracks were visible to all. The man who once spoke with authority at county meetings now sat in silence, his eyes distant, his jaw clenched. His drinking worsened. No longer a glass of brandy to close the evening, but bottle after bottle emptied before dawn. Servants reported hearing him in the dead of night pacing the halls, muttering in fragments, cursing names that no one could recognize. More than once he smashed mirrors in his chambers as though he could no longer bear the sight of his own reflection. But the most disturbing transformation was not in his habits. It was in his faith. Thomas, once a dutiful churchman, stopped attending services. He claimed he was ill, but the truth was darker. Caroline had introduced him to something else, something older. She placed books before him, fragments of philosophy, heretical texts, obscure manuscripts about testing the soul through fire. Thomas devoured them like a starving man, his eyes hollow, his hands trembling as he read by candlelight until the wax burned to nothing. Publicly, his decline could no longer be concealed. At a winter gathering, he erupted in fury when a neighboring planter mentioned James Carter's name. Witnesses recalled his face turning red, his voice trembling with rage as he declared, "The dead have no claim here." The room fell silent. From that moment, the whispers began. Ashford had lost his mind. Ashford was dangerous. Ashford was cursed, and Caroline, she only grew stronger. While Thomas unraveled, she glowed. She became the one neighbors respected, admired, feared. They said her eyes seemed brighter, her voice sharper, her presence impossible to ignore. Some whispered she was a witch. Others said she had bound her husband under a spell. But whether sorcery or psychology, the effect was the same. Caroline had become the true master of the manor. The wager had shifted. What began as a simple test of seduction had transformed into a ritual of dominance. Caroline had proven she could dismantle Thomas's pride. Now she was dismantling his sanity. And the question that lingered, heavy as smoke in every room, was this: how much longer before Thomas would snap completely and drag them both into ruin? The break came suddenly, though the signs had been building for months. On a cold January night, with frost thick on the fields and the James River glazed in ice, Thomas Ashford erupted. Witnesses later said they heard the shouts echoing across the estate, a voice no longer human, but animal, guttural, tearing through the stillness of winter like a blade. The servants were the first to see it. Thomas, drunk and wild-eyed, stormed into the great hall with a pistol in one hand and a lantern in the other. He demanded every door be locked, every window sealed. He accused his own household of conspiring against him, of whispering secrets to James Carter's ghost. His hand shook as he swung the pistol from face to terrified face, ordering confessions that never came. Then, in a frenzy, he smashed the lantern against the wall, sending flames licking up the woodwork before collapsing to his knees, sobbing in a pool of whiskey and kerosene. Caroline appeared calm, almost serene. She dismissed the staff, doused the fire before it could spread, and led her husband back to his chambers. To the outside world, she presented this episode as nothing more than an unfortunate illness. But behind closed doors, she fanned the flames of his paranoia. She whispered that he was being watched, that James's spirit lingered not as punishment but as a test, that the only way to prove himself was to cleanse their world of weakness through blood, and Thomas believed her. His mind was fractured, and in that fracture her voice was the only thing that mattered. He began speaking of purges and sacrifices, of enemies hidden in plain sight. He locked away ledgers, burned correspondence, and drew strange symbols into the margins of his family Bible. When neighbors inquired about his absence from public affairs, Caroline answered with poise, her beauty and composure masking the horror unraveling in her home. But there is a truth you must see here. Madness rarely grows alone. It is cultivated, guided, manipulated. Caroline was not merely watching her husband fall apart, she was directing the descent. Every whisper was a nudge deeper into the abyss. Every suggestion planted another seed of violence, and soon Thomas would act. Not in secret this time, not with precision, but openly, violently, leaving behind the kind of carnage that no whisper, no charm, no crimson dress could ever disguise. The wager was entering its final phase, and the price for losing was death. The first public killing came not in the shadows of the manor, but in broad daylight, as if Thomas Ashford wanted the world to see that he had crossed the threshold from man to monster. It happened during a county gathering in February 1861, a meeting of planters to discuss the coming war and the tightening chokehold of Union blockade rumors. Men gathered in their tailored coats, sipping brandy, speaking of politics with the calm assurance of those who believed their world unshakable. But Thomas was no longer capable of playing the role of gentleman. Witnesses said he rose without warning, his face pale, his eyes hollow, carrying with him the silence of the grave. Across the room stood a merchant, a man who had once been James Carter's business partner, a man Thomas now believed was whispering about him behind closed doors. Without hesitation, Thomas drew a knife from beneath his coat and drove it straight into the man's chest. Gasps, screams, chaos. The meeting collapsed into madness as blood pooled on the polished wood floor, staining the boots of Virginia's finest. Thomas did not flee. He stood over the dying man, breathing heavily, muttering words no one could understand. Some swore he spoke Latin, others claimed it was scripture twisted beyond recognition. But all agreed it was not the voice of reason. It was the voice of possession. The sheriff should have intervened, should have brought Thomas in chains before a court. But money, politics, and fear silenced justice. The Ashfords were too prominent, too deeply entangled in debts and favors, too dangerous to confront directly. The incident was written off as a fit of temporary derangement, a phrase that served as both excuse and shield. And Caroline? She emerged unscathed. In fact, she used the aftermath to tighten her control. She soothed the neighbors, smoothed the gossip, paid off the right officials. She convinced the county that her husband was ill, that he was a victim of strain, and that no further danger threatened their community. Her poise was so flawless that many began to admire her strength rather than question her role. But those who lived in Riverside Manor saw the truth. They saw Thomas growing darker each day, feeding on violence like a starving wolf. They saw Caroline at his side, calm as ever, whispering in his ear. The wager had birthed something unstoppable, and the blood on the county floor was only the beginning. This was no longer seduction. This was war. War against sanity, against order, against the very structure of society itself. And the Ashfords were winning. The killing in the county hall was not an isolated act. It was a signal, a gateway, and once crossed, Thomas Ashford could never return. What followed was a campaign of violence so methodical, so deliberate, that it no longer looked like madness. It looked like ritual. Caroline was the architect. She no longer needed to cloak her intentions behind sweet whispers. Now she spoke openly to Thomas of sacrifice, of cleansing, of proving themselves worthy of forces older and greater than Virginia's laws or God's church. She dressed his madness in the robes of purpose. and he followed her without question. It began with the servants. A stable hand went missing, his body later found in the woods, throat cut and chest carved with strange markings that no doctor could explain. Then a maid vanished, her apron discovered near the river, stained with blood, but her corpse never found. Each disappearance was hushed, bought off with hush money or threats, but inside the manor the truth was unmistakable. The killings were not random. They were escalating. They were becoming ceremonial. Thomas no longer drank with friends, no longer gambled in taverns. He locked himself in the library for hours, poring over old tomes and scratching bizarre sigils into the margins of scripture. By candlelight, Caroline guided his hand, teaching him incantations she claimed had come from whispers in the dark. Their Bible was no longer the word of God. It was a ledger of sacrifice, a catalogue of debts and blood payments. At night, smoke and screams drifted from the fields. Slaves were taken from their cabins and dragged into the woods. Some never returned. Those who did spoke of masked figures, of fires burning in strange circles, of Thomas standing bare-chested with a knife in hand while Caroline stood beside him in her crimson gown, her face serene, her voice leading chants that made the very trees seem to tremble. And yet, in the daylight, the Ashfords remained untouchable. Caroline hosted gatherings, smiled at neighbors, charmed ministers. Thomas sat silent but imposing, his eyes burning holes through anyone who dared question him. The county whispered, but none dared confront them directly, because by then everyone in Richmond had heard the same rumor. The Ashfords were no longer merely husband and wife. They were high priest and priestess of something unspeakable, and those who stood in their way would be the next sacrifice. By the spring of 1861, Riverside Manor was no longer simply a home. It was a shrine of terror. The line between private vice and public rumor had blurred, and the whispers carried beyond the county into Richmond itself. People spoke of fires on the horizon, of music that wasn't music drifting through the woods, of faces seen in the windows at midnight, faces that did not belong to the living. Caroline orchestrated everything with the precision of a conductor. She had transformed Thomas's descent into a spectacle, one that fed her influence and cloaked her ambition. The rituals grew more elaborate, more theatrical. Where once it had been blood on a blade in the darkness, now it was processions by torchlight, masks carved from animal skulls, chants in a language that even Thomas could not understand. Neighbors began to vanish. At first, only the vulnerable, the poor farmer, the wandering drifter, the servant no one would miss. But then it escalated. A prominent deacon disappeared after a quarrel with Thomas. A young woman who had spurned Thomas in his youth was found hanging from a tree, her body desecrated in ways too grotesque to describe. Every death seemed deliberate, chosen. Each life extinguished was a payment toward something Caroline had promised her husband, but never named aloud. And the county, terrified though it was, remained paralyzed. Who would dare accuse the Ashfords? Who would stand against a family that seemed shielded not just by wealth and status, but by something darker? Ministers who preached against them soon fell ill. Judges who muttered suspicions suffered accidents on the road. Those who whispered too loudly often vanished altogether. Inside the manor, Thomas was no longer the gambler or the brash planter's son. He had become something else entirely. He walked the halls at night muttering prayers that were not prayers, carrying a blade as if it were a holy relic. His once handsome face had grown gaunt, his eyes hollow yet burning. And always at his side was Caroline, regal in her crimson silks, the silent high priestess of his ruin. But here is the truth the county dared not speak. Caroline no longer needed Thomas to gamble, or even to kill. She had achieved something greater. She had created a cult, with Thomas as her weapon and the county as her altar. Riverside Manor was a place of worship now, but what they worshipped was not God. And in the rising shadow of war, the Ashfords were preparing a sacrifice the world would never forget. The year 1861 bled into war. Virginia seceded, the cannons roared at Sumter, and suddenly the nation itself fractured. For most, the Civil War was terror, uncertainty, and upheaval. But for Caroline Ashford, it was opportunity. The chaos of war cloaked her designs like a velvet shroud. Men vanished every day. Conscripts marched off to fight. Deserters slipped into the woods. Families fled the advancing Union lines. Who would question another disappearance when death itself had become routine? Who would investigate the fires at Riverside Manor when the whole countryside burned with the smoke of war? Caroline understood this perfectly. She whispered to Thomas that the war was a sign, that their sacrifices had brought about the cleansing of the land. He believed her with the fervor of a zealot. No longer was he simply murdering in secret. He was performing holy rites to aid the Confederacy, convinced that each throat cut and each body offered in blood would tilt the scales of battle in Virginia's favor, and people noticed. Soldiers quartered near the Ashford estate reported strange gatherings in the woods. Some claimed to see lines of figures in crimson and black moving under torchlight, chanting in a rhythm that matched the distant drums of war. Others told of screams in the night, quickly cut short, leaving behind only silence and the crackle of fire. But none dared interfere. A war was raging, and the Ashfords were wealthy, connected, untouchable. If a soldier vanished, it was blamed on desertion. If a messenger disappeared en route to Richmond, it was the Yankees. If a neighbor's family was never seen again, it was war. Always war. Meanwhile, Riverside Manor swelled with power. Caroline began inviting select men, disillusioned officers, desperate planters, broken widowers, into her fold. They came seeking comfort, guidance, and strength, and she gave it to them in exchange for loyalty sealed in blood. What began as a wager between two gamblers had become a secret cult feeding on the chaos of a nation tearing itself apart. And yet, beneath the grandeur of ritual and the smokescreen of war, a darker truth brewed. The sacrifices were not bringing victory. Confederate soldiers still fell in droves. Union armies pressed further south. Thomas grew restless, furious, convinced more blood was needed. Caroline, ever poised, did not resist. She only smiled and told him he was right. The Civil War had given them cover. But soon the cover would not be enough. The hunger they had unleashed would demand more, much more. By the winter of 1862, Thomas Ashford was no longer the man his wife had married. He had become something else, something raw, feral, and frightening even to those who had once admired his charm. His eyes, once quick with laughter, now darted in fevered paranoia. His voice, once smooth and persuasive, broke into guttural shouts in the dead of night, echoing through the halls of Riverside Manor like the cries of a hunted animal. The rituals had changed him. The killings had hollowed him out. He began to claim visions, bloody apparitions whispering strategies for the Confederacy, pale phantoms urging him to slit more throats in the name of victory. He carved strange symbols into the walls of his study, symbols no priest could identify, lines and spirals that twisted like snakes across the plaster. Caroline encouraged it at first, seeing it as a mark of devotion. But soon she realized that the visions were no longer hers to control. At dinner, Thomas would fall silent, staring at his guests with a predator's gaze, as if measuring their weight, their fear, their usefulness. On more than one occasion, Caroline had to intervene as he gripped a knife too tightly, his hand trembling, his face slick with sweat. Some guests excused themselves and never returned. Others never left at all. Worse still, the enslaved workers on the estate began whispering about him. They claimed to see him wandering the fields at midnight, barefoot, shirtless, covered in ash and blood. They said he carried on conversations with no one, arguing, pleading, cursing the shadows. Some swore they heard him howling like a wolf when the moon was high. Caroline fought to keep order, to maintain appearances, but the truth was spreading. Even their loyal followers whispered that Thomas was becoming unhinged. And yet the more unstable he grew, the more dangerous he became. His violence was no longer calculated, it was impulsive, unpredictable. Anyone could be a sacrifice. Anyone could become the offering for his phantom visions. Caroline faced a dilemma she had never anticipated. She had created this monster, sharpened his hunger, and unleashed his madness. But now he was beginning to frighten her. The question that clawed at her every night was one she could not admit aloud. Could she still control Thomas Ashford? Or had she birthed a storm that would one day consume even her? Caroline Ashford had always believed she could bend men like branches, pliant, obedient, useful. For years, Thomas had proven her theory correct. But now, she faced something she had not anticipated. A man so consumed by visions that he no longer bowed even to her will. She watched him closely, never letting him see the flicker of fear in her eyes. He raved about generals and battles, insisting that Richmond itself would fall unless the ritual of rivers was performed, an offering so vast, so terrible, it would flood the James with blood. He muttered about burning every enslaved worker on the estate, about sacrificing whole families at once to summon victory. His madness no longer hid in shadows. It spilled into every corner of their lives. Caroline did what she had always done. She adapted. She whispered into his ear that she understood him, that she too had heard the voices. She fanned the flames of his delusion, all while keeping her true thoughts locked away. Behind the veil of loyalty, she began to plan. First, she shored up her allies. The men she had brought into the fold, the officers, the planters, the broken widowers. She began speaking to them in private, planting doubts about Thomas's stability. She framed it as concern, as love for her husband. But every word was measured, designed to turn their loyalty away from Thomas and toward herself. Slowly their glances shifted, less reverence for him, more trust in her. Second, she began gathering knowledge. She scoured the old ledgers, journals, and occult texts hidden in the manor's library. She sought out symbols and rites older than anything Thomas had scribbled in his madness. If she was to keep her grip on power, she needed more than charm and fear. She needed a weapon to wield against him. And finally, she began watching Thomas the way a hunter watches wounded prey. Every outburst, every sleepless night, every frenzied ramble was another crack in his armor. The man she had once seduced into darkness was unraveling before her eyes, and she knew the day was coming when she would have to make a choice. To preserve her empire of blood, Caroline Ashford would either have to leash the beast she had created or kill him herself. The breaking point came in the spring of 1863. The war had grown bloodier. The land itself seemed soaked in death, and Thomas Ashford could no longer contain the storm that raged inside his mind. For weeks, he muttered about betrayal, about spies in their midst, traitors poisoning the rituals, unseen enemies watching from the trees. His paranoia hardened into conviction, and then it exploded. One night after a rainstorm, Thomas stormed into the great hall with a pistol in one hand and a bloodied knife in the other. His eyes glowed wild in the flicker of the firelight. Gathered before him were several enslaved workers, forced to kneel on the wooden floor, trembling. Behind them, two of their loyal followers, men who had once trusted his visions, watched in horror. They whisper lies, Thomas roared. They curse the offerings, they weaken the rites. The Confederacy bleeds because of them. His voice cracked, half human, half something primal. He pressed the pistol against the temple of a young boy no older than 12. Caroline stepped forward, her face calm, her voice honeyed. Thomas, my love, the voices are testing you. They want to see if you can master the storm inside. Put down the weapon. Show them your strength. For a moment it seemed to work. His hand trembled, lowering the pistol slightly. But then, with a savage scream, he pulled the trigger. The boy fell lifeless to the floor, his blood spreading across the planks like ink on parchment. Gasps filled the hall. One of the kneeling men cried out, only to be silenced as Thomas slashed his throat with the knife. The room erupted into chaos. Followers shouted in terror, some fleeing, others frozen in place. Caroline did not move. She simply watched, her green eyes unblinking, as her husband descended into frenzy, killing without reason, drenched in blood and sweat, his body shaking like a man possessed. That night, Riverside Manor became a slaughterhouse. By dawn, 7 bodies lay sprawled across the hall, their lives extinguished not by ritual precision, but by raw, unhinged violence. Caroline knew then. Thomas had become too dangerous to control. He was no longer a vessel of power. He was a liability, a madness that threatened to unravel everything she had built. And as the first rays of sunlight broke across the blood-stained floor, she silently made her decision. Thomas Ashford would not live to see another season. Caroline Ashford had always played the long game. Seduction, manipulation, ritual, power, everything she touched bent to her will. And now she turned that same calculating brilliance upon her own husband. She could not kill Thomas recklessly. His madness had alienated some, yes, but many still clung to him, believing his vision sacred, his violence necessary. To strike openly would fracture the cult, risk losing everything she had carved out of shadows and blood. Now his death had to be seen as destiny. It had to look inevitable, like the hand of the gods themselves reaching down to silence him. So she began weaving the trap. Quiet whispers to her loyalists, concerns voiced in confidence, doubts slipped like venom into their ears. She told them that the voices were no longer with Thomas, that he had strayed, that his visions were now false echoes. She reminded them of the boy's execution, of the slaughter in the hall. Was this the mark of divine power or a man possessed by madness? They listened, and though some resisted, the seed had been planted. Caroline knew doubt spreads faster than faith. Next, she secured the symbols. In the library, hidden behind ledgers of plantation accounts, she found fragments of older rites, spells of severance, rituals designed not to summon, but to banish. She memorized their forms, traced their lines into the soft wax of candles, stitched them into her garments. If Thomas believed the spirits whispered to him, then she would become the louder voice. Finally, she prepared the stage. A gathering was called for Midsummer's Eve, when the veil was said to thin, when blood carried the greatest weight. The followers were summoned, the altar was cleansed, the fires stoked. Caroline moved through it all with poise, her every gesture a silent promise that order would be restored. And Thomas, he was eager, too eager. He ranted that the night would bring revelation, that the Confederacy's fate hung on his blade. He boasted of rivers running red. His followers nodded nervously, but Caroline smiled. She knew they were already hers. The trap was ready. The beast she had created would walk willingly into his own undoing, believing he was fulfilling destiny, blind to the fact that the destiny had been rewritten by the woman who once whispered him into darkness. The night of Midsummer's Eve arrived heavy with storm clouds, the air swollen with heat and silence. Riverside Manor's great hall had been transformed into a temple of shadows. Candles lined the walls in uneven rows, their flames licking the dark, their wax dripping like melted flesh. A great circle had been drawn in ash and blood across the floor, symbols curling inward toward the altar where Thomas Ashford stood, trembling with fevered ecstasy. He raised his arms high, his blood-stained shirt hanging loose on his wasted frame. His eyes blazed with the light of madness. "Tonight," he roared, "we summon victory. Tonight the rivers drink deep, and Virginia herself is reborn in fire." His voice cracked, a man proclaiming prophecy while teetering on the edge of ruin. Caroline stood beside him, serene, radiant in her dark gown, her green eyes reflecting the candlelight like glass. To the followers gathered in the shadows, she seemed almost divine, the calm counterpoint to her husband's chaos. They did not see the dagger hidden within the folds of her dress, nor the sigils stitched into her hem. Symbols meant not for summoning, but for severance. The ritual began. Thomas chanted, his voice rising in a guttural rhythm, demanding blood. He called for sacrifices, but when his hand reached for one of the kneeling captives, Caroline stepped forward, her voice cutting the air like a blade. "No, my love. Tonight the offering is not theirs. Tonight, it is yours." A ripple passed through the crowd. Confusion, fear, murmurs that hushed themselves as Caroline lifted her hands, revealing the patterns of blood painted across her palms, patterns that matched the old rites she had stolen. Thomas froze. His wild eyes darted to her, uncertain. "What are you saying?" he hissed. His hand trembled on the knife, but for the first time doubt crept into his madness. Caroline's voice lowered, steady, commanding. "The spirits are not with you anymore. They abandoned you the night you slaughtered without meaning. You are no vessel, you are a broken shell. And tonight I release you." Before he could move, she struck. The dagger slid from her gown, flashing in the candlelight, and drove deep into his chest. His scream split the hall, a sound more beast than man, before it collapsed into silence. The followers gasped, some crossing themselves, others falling to their knees. Caroline stood tall over his body, her face calm, her voice unshaken. The madness is ended. The true covenant begins, and in that moment, the cult was hers. The body of Thomas Ashford lay sprawled across the blood circle, his eyes glazed, his mouth frozen in a twisted gasp that still seemed to echo through the chamber. The storm outside finally broke, thunder rolling across the Virginia hills as rain hammered the roof of Riverside Manor. It was as if the heavens themselves had marked his passing. But Caroline did not flinch. She stepped over his corpse with the poise of a queen ascending her throne. Her gown, streaked with blood, clung to her like armor. The dagger dripped steadily onto the floorboards as she turned to face the assembly. Every gaze was fixed on her, fearful, uncertain, waiting to see which way the scales would tip. She raised her voice low and steady, carrying over the roar of the storm. Tonight the false prophet has fallen. The spirits have spoken and I have obeyed. The blood spilled here is not chaos. It is covenant. From this night forward, we are bound not by madness, but by power, true power. The words carved themselves into the minds of those gathered. Some bowed immediately, overwhelmed by the force of her presence. Others hesitated, torn between fear and loyalty. But one by one they bent. No one dared stand against her. Caroline knew she had won. Not just control of the cult, not just the estate, but something greater. She had crossed the threshold Thomas had stumbled at. Where madness consumed him, she had mastered it. She was no vessel. She was the hand itself. Over the weeks that followed, she reshaped the cult in her image. The wild blood rites of Thomas were replaced with careful, measured ceremonies. Sacrifice continued, but under her control, rituals designed not to appease visions, but to build a legacy. She courted officers, whispered into the ears of politicians, drew new men into her circle. Where Thomas had spiraled inward, Caroline reached outward, weaving her influence into the very fabric of a fractured confederacy. And in the shadows, she kept her husband's journals, his symbols, his ravings. She studied them not with fear but with fascination. For she understood now, madness and prophecy are separated only by mastery. Thomas had been consumed. She would consume. The storm that ended his life had not washed the blood away. It had baptized her. Caroline Ashford, the widow, the witch, the queen of shadows, would walk into history unrecorded, unspoken, unseen. Yet her covenant of blood would whisper through the soil of Virginia for generations. And those who came too close to the Ashford estate long after the war still swore they felt eyes watching from the dark. A woman's voice whispering promises of power and a shadow that never quite died.